Welcome to a spiritual offering from Trinity Church, Boonville, with the sermon of Mother Linda Logan for the third Sunday of Lent.
In the name of the one holy God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. Amen. The place on which you are standing is holy ground. This is what God said to Moses. It wasn't the first thing God said. The first thing God said was Moses' name. Moses had turned aside to see why the bush that was flaming was not burning up. And when God saw that Moses' attention had been caught, God called to Moses, Out of the heart of the fire, God called Moses by name. And when Moses responded, "Here I am," God said, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." Remove his sandals. Why? So he could feel the ground beneath his feet, feel that it was solid, so he could have physical contact with something that was of God, this God he could not see. Or was it so he couldn't run away across the dry brush and rocks of the wilderness that held the wildness of encounter with God? The text doesn't answer these questions, not directly anyway. But what it relays next is what made Moses hide his face. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And with that statement of the lineage of God's association with Moses' people, his people of origin, the people back in the land of the Pharaoh from whom Moses has fled, God declares that God has heard that people's cry, that God knows their sufferings and has come to deliver them from oppression, and that the human being through whom God will act is none other than the person to whom God is now speaking through the fire of the bush, Moses. Moses, whose name, though Egyptian, was given in Hebrew the meaning of "he who draws out." He who was drawn out of the water at the direction of Pharaoh's daughter becomes he who draws out of Egypt the people who were suffering under Pharaoh's oppression. What's in a name? Quite a bit in the case of Moses. And so begins the story of the Exodus. It's a long story, covering not just the escape from Egypt, from Pharaoh and his pursuing army, with its climax in the waters of the sea, but also the years of wandering, 40 of them, before the people finally find their way into the land of God's promise. 40 years, during which the people enter into covenant with God, agreeing to live by the law or teaching of God. This is the foundational story of Judaism. And because Christian faith has its source in Jewish faith, it is foundational for us Christians too. Foundational, that is, forming the foundation or base of our faith. What does this foundational story tell us? That God hears the cries of people in pain and relieves their suffering. How? Through persons who act in God's Spirit. Persons who take their own relationship with God to be directive. Persons who understand that love of God must be expressed through care of people. Like many of you, I have been riveted by the news of the last 3 weeks, going from one news channel to another to take in what is happening in Ukraine. I've gone from feeling stunned that this could be happening in our time in Europe to knowing with a leadenness that persists that thousands of men, women, and children are being killed. Millions more are being driven into homelessness and refugee status, and cities are being laid waste, their residential flats and government, cultural, and commercial buildings ravaged by fire and collapse from Russian missiles. The invading Russian troops are being met with armed resistance, most of it by men who just weeks before were working in civilian jobs. But the devastation continues. At the midpoint of this past week, the United Nations announced that one child was becoming a refugee every second in Ukraine. An entire country is under attack because of the evil of one man. But that country is defending its nationhood, rallied continuously by one other man, President Volodymyr Zelensky. Zelensky has a degree in law, but he was an unlikely candidate when he ran for the office of president. He had gone into comedy and acting and had created a production company which produced films, cartoons, and TV shows, including the immensely popular TV series Servant of the People. In that production, he played the part of a history teacher who became the Ukrainian president. In 2019, Zelensky announced his candidacy for the actual position of President of Ukraine, running as an anti-establishment and anti-corruption candidate. He won the election with more than 73% of the vote. Since the start of the Russian hostilities, President Zelensky has been everywhere among the Ukrainian people, rallying them, visiting soldiers and civilians in the streets and hospitals, addressing them and the wider world from underground locations or his presidential office, not just refusing to be cowed by Putin, but offering to meet with him. He has also pleaded for military assistance from European countries and from us. Ukraine is receiving military and humanitarian assistance from Europe and the United States. But the two forms of defense Zelensky most sought, he has not received. Admission to NATO, a status which would have required that the NATO countries come to Ukraine's defense, and the declaration of a no-fly zone over Ukraine. The viciousness of Putin's assault continues, with no regard for the presence of children or women in labor. Schools and hospitals collapse in flames, and death threats hang over Ukraine's president and his family daily. Zelensky is standing on holy ground. Out of the fire that rages before him, he has responded to the call of his name. But you know what? You too are called, for God calls each of us. God calls each of us to respond to suffering, to lead people out of their pain, and into the place of God's promise. What are you doing to help the Ukrainian people? What are you doing for the people of Afghanistan? Or the people suffering violence and extreme poverty in Central America? Or conflict, drought, and famine in sub-Saharan Africa? What are you doing for the people who manage to get out of desperate conditions, scrambling onto buses or planes or trains, or walking mile after mile, some of them through country after country, through deserts or jungles, or crossing choppy seas in overloaded boats? All of these desperate measures undertaken to escape suffering and death back in the place they called home. God calls our names too. Out of the heart of the fires that rage, God calls each of us to respond. Where we are standing is holy ground.
You have been listening to a spiritual offering from Trinity Episcopal Church located on Schuyler Street in Boonville. We're glad to be part of your day, and we invite you to join us in person for our weekly service at 9 o'clock Sunday mornings.